Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm your host Andrew Snyder, and I am always grateful for your company. This episode will involve a couple of firsts for me. This will be my first recorded episode with a live guest, and also with a video component, and so if you're listening to this through your podcast feed, know that you can also find it over on YouTube. But before we continue, I want to thank each of my patrons for your support. And so many thanks to Joe, Aaron, Mark, Ida, William, Jocelyn, Lynn, Art, Other Aaron, Emmy, Ian, Laura, Tony, Barbara, Stash, Paul, Matthew, Don, Clinton, Jamie, Andrew, Harrison, and Patrick. This is a great community that continues to get bigger and better, and I couldn't keep it up without you. And the more support that I receive, the more time that I can commit to improving quality and quantity of content, including with more collaborations with great guests. And if you join at the Super Patron tier or higher, you'll gain access to all of my exclusive content, including my series on Grimm's Fairy Tales. You'll get early content of Mythic Mind, as some of you on Patreon may know if you're currently listening to this long before the public release date. And you'll also receive full access to my weekly Substack, summarizing and reflecting on Tolkien's letters. And so go ahead and head over to patreon.com/AndrewNSnyder to show your support and to get access to everything that this community has to offer. Now first, as you may be able to figure out from the title of this episode, the schedule has shifted around a little bit. Because I'm working with a number of guests this season, you can expect that things might move around from time to time, either because of my schedule or because of theirs. And so with that being said, today I'll be welcoming Thomas Salerno to the show as we discuss Leaf by Niggle, among other things. Now I know this may be a surprise to you, and so if you haven't read the story yet, I'd encourage you to hit pause and go ahead and do so now before moving forward, so you can get the most out of it, both the most out of the story as well as out of this podcast. It is short, and so even if you don't own a copy of Tales from the Perilous Realm, which I would recommend that you do, you can actually find this story, Leaf by Niggle, online with a quick Google search. So go ahead and read it and then come back. All right, so as I said, today I'm welcoming Thomas Salerno to the show. Now, Thomas is an author, he's an essayist, podcaster, and a freelance editor. He has a BA in anthropology from Stony Brook University and has been working as a professional writer since 2020. His essays and articles are largely focused on exploring sci-fi and fantasy literature and film from a Catholic perspective. He's contributed chapters for 2 anthologies published by Voyage Comics, Tolkien and Faith in 2021 and The Christ Bearer, coming out in 2023, and he plans to self-publish his own essay collection in the near future. Thomas is the creator and host of the Perilous Realms podcast, where he continues his search for the good, the true, and the beautiful in fantasy and science fiction. You can follow his work on his website, thomasjsalernowrites.com, and his newsletter, thomasjsalerno.substack.com. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation, even a fraction as much as I have. All right, there we go. All right, Thomas, thank you so much for coming on as my first guest on Mythic Mind.
Thanks, Andrew. It's a blast to be on this show. I love talking to other Tolkien aficionados.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of my favorite things to do, as we were kind of discussing before we got recording.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, Tolkien aficionado is a term that, man, I almost feel uncomfortable applying to myself because I once heard it said that, everyone kind of has Tolkien imposter syndrome, where whenever you're talking about Tolkien publicly, you always feel like there's, somebody making fun of you in Quenya somewhere.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right. So let's start off kind of, broadly. Tell me about some of the major projects you're currently working on.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I should mention that because I don't think I actually put this in the bio that I sent you, which is that a friend and I, my friend Jake Dobrins, who's the president of Theophany Media, we actually recently launched a new Substack called Uncharted Faith, which is at unchartedfaith.substack.com, which is all about Christian speculative fiction. So we're posting our own short stories on this platform because both of us have a real passion to want to write more short stories in 2023. So we're like, well, what's a way we can make ourselves accountable? Well, let's set up a Substack, and then we'll be forced to do it. But no, yeah, I love fiction. I love reading fiction, and I have this desire to write more fiction, especially this year. So that's definitely one thing that I've been working on. Also, I'm trying to put together an essay collection that I hope to self-publish in the not too distant future. I've written a lot of articles and essays online over the past few years about fantasy and science fiction and comic books, looking at them from a Christian perspective. And I'd really like to collect a lot of my best work and put it out there in a single volume, because it's often difficult when you're trying to when you tell people you're a writer. One of the first things they ask is, where can I read your work? And if it's scattered all over the place, it's difficult to tell people. I want to be able to tell people, just buy my book and give them the link to my book. So that's another one of the projects that I'm working on this year. But I'm always busy. I'm writing and podcasting a lot. I have been since because I started as a professional writer in 2020, right as the pandemic hit. It was kind of my fallback thing after my other career was kind of torpedoed by COVID, like a lot of people.
Right.
But yeah, no, I love doing this. I love being able to just express myself creatively as a job, and it's I hope that this year we'll see a lot of growth in that area.
Yeah, fantastic. I definitely sympathize with the question of where can I find you? And at this point, my answer is, I don't know, the internet.
Yeah.
So obviously there's some common threads through all of what you do. You're mostly dealing in the world of fiction at this point, right?
Right. Yeah. Which is very different from my previous career, because I was actually in museum science. I studied anthropology in college, and I worked in museums in anthropology and paleontology. So in the natural sciences area, which I still have a big passion for, and I hope to incorporate that passion into my fiction someday. But yeah, but I've been a fan of comic books and science fiction for pretty much as long as I can remember. And I actually only got into fantasy really with Tolkien when I was 13. And I first read The Lord of the Rings, because when I was 13, the Peter Jackson movies were just starting to come out. And it's funny. I like telling this story because I'm one of the few people in my generation who didn't take to Harry Potter right away. Like I've got nothing against it. It's just that for whatever reason, it didn't really work for me. And like I was recommended, well, why don't you read Lord of the Rings? And I was like, oh, wizards again? I don't really know about that. But no, I read an article about the Lord of the Rings and about its kind of Christian symbolism, a magazine article. And for the life of me, I can't remember which magazine or where this was, but it got me interested. And so I went out to my nearest bookstore, Borders, when it existed, and I bought paperback copies of the trilogy and devoured them. And I was just like, this is like, The Lord of the Rings changed my life. Like it really just opened a whole new vista of what you could do with fiction, like that I hadn't even thought of before. I had always dabbled in writing as a kid, but I had never really realized, the kind of just deep and profound, stories that were possible to tell with fiction. I had just kind of read, mostly superficial kind of stories before that. And The Lord of the Rings just changed my whole outlook on that. It's a little bit dangerous because like all of us writers, like especially in fantasy, have a tendency to want to imitate our hero. But yeah, I definitely say that I owe a lot to Tolkien. I probably would not be the writer that I am today without him.
Yeah, I can absolutely sympathize with that. I mean, it's hard to encounter Tolkien and come back the same, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that's always what happened to you. Enter the Perilous Realm, which is something that we'll be talking a bit about. But even before we get there, like I said, I can definitely sympathize with the life-changing impact of Tolkien. It's not like you're just reading a story. It's like you're entering into a different plane of reality almost.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly how Tolkien describes it, right? He's not creating, he's sub-creating something true.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Now, unfortunately, I didn't discover this when I was 13. I discovered this when I was like 30. So yeah, I'm still pretty new to this game, but I just kind of went all in as soon as I started.
Yeah, that's
Um,
amazing. I would love to discover it all over again. That's just, yeah, you can really discover Tolkien at any age.
mhm,
I think it's just so broadly applicable across age groups and cultures, languages,
mhm,
religions. It's just such it, like you said, he's tapping into something true, right?
mhm,
So I just think it has this kind of universal appeal that, very few there's a few great stories which have that kind of universal appeal, and
mhm.
Tolkien's Legendarium is definitely one of them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why the great poets of antiquity, your Homer or whoever, they were counted as prophets, right?
Right,
Because
yeah.
there was something powerful and almost world shaping in their writing. And I recently started reading the Carpenter biography of Tolkien, uh,
Oh, okay, yeah.
which had really been illuminating. Seeing just how ingrained he was in these great world shaping stories of the past, even of the pagan world. And I feel like he was able to tap into something true there, but then sort of kind of baptize it, even
Yes.
if not intentionally.
Yes, yes, absolutely. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that, because like that kind of goes back to what I'm titling my essay collection is baptizing the new mythology.
Oh wow.
Because science fiction, fantasy, comic books are like the new mythology,
Mhm,
and we can find ways to baptize them by looking at them
mhm,
through a Christian lens. Just
mhm,
like Tolkien baptized his beloved Norse mythology by taking what was good and true and beautiful in it
mhm,
and raising it up to just a higher pitch, a higher plane, you know.
mhm,
And that's just what I find fascinating about one of the many things I find fascinating about his world, is just that he was able to take that, you know, because I've actually read a little bit of Norse mythology. It is very
mhm.
depressing, like
I mean, yeah, and ultimately in the end, in the Norse mythos, the good guys lose, right?
right, yeah,
uh, which is, I think, one thing that makes Tolkien so magnificent. The whole idea of the long defeat, right? He takes
right, yeah,
that largely from the Northern Germans, and he says, yeah, they were actually right in that light is dwindling from this world. But what makes the Christian turn is that there's this eucatastrophe at the end that kind of brings everything around.
yes, yeah.
I was recently thinking about the fact that the Battle of Helm's Deep is a good picture of this, in
Oh
that
yeah.
the idea of the noble men fighting against the monsters until the last one falls. Right, that right there is the Germanic tale. What makes it a Christian tale is that Gandalf comes with the morning light.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And the fact, I think that was on purpose, because the fact that the Rohirrim are essentially his stand-ins for the Norse
Mm-hmm.
figures. I think he wanted to craft Helm's Deep as kind of his sort of commentary, his answer to what a classic
Mm-hmm.
Norse tale would be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that.
So, kind of more broadly, we've kind of already touched on this, but why are you so interested in this intersection between fiction or myth and the Christian faith? What is the connection there?
I think part of it is definitely because, I'm what's called a cradle Catholic. I was baptized into the faith as an infant, raised in the church, and I've always had a very strong sense of Catholic identity. But at the same time, I've also had a lifelong identity as kind of a nerd. I was into comic books and science fiction before that became kind of mainstream, with the Marvel movies and the
Mm-hmm.
newer Star Wars films, how all that stuff is mainstream now. But I still have a memory of a time where it was not really cool to be into that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff, and to always be carrying around a notebook at school where you scribbled in your story ideas into it. So it's like I've always wanted there to be a way to kind of fuse my two
Mm-hmm.
great interests, or two,
Mm-hmm.
my two identities as like a person who is into this kind of fiction, who's constantly reading, and my love of reading and literature, and my faith. And luckily, I was able to find a way to do that through writing, through writing essays and articles and stuff like that. But I also think that I've been interested since I was a teenager, when I saw there was this documentary, and I can't remember which channel it was on, but it was a documentary about Star Wars, and it talked about the monomyth. How George Lucas was very interested in Campbell's idea of the monomyth, and how kind of all the great stories of the world are kind of telling the same few archetypal stories over and over again. And I eventually saw, I was in Washington, D.C. when they had an exhibit based on these ideas at the Smithsonian. And I actually have the book based on that exhibit. I think it's called Star Wars, The Magic of Myth. And they talked more about the monomyth and stuff like that. And that got me interested in mythology as applied to modern storytelling. What can modern storytelling learn from the way stories have been told for thousands of years through myths? And when I learned that Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were also interested in that, I became even more fascinated with this idea. And how like Lewis calls, the Gospels the true myth, that they are myth, that he didn't like this idea that myth means lie or untruth. Where no, it's exactly the opposite. A myth is telling profound spiritual and moral truths. It's just that the Gospels and the entire scriptures just happen to be true, that they are the true myths. But that doesn't invalidate the meaning and importance of the other global mythologies and folklores. I think that there's always something that can be taught, especially because in the patristic period, the fathers talked about the seeds of the gospel, and how the seeds of the gospel, the seeds of the word, can be found even in what then were considered secular mythologies. And I've just been fascinated with that idea, and in both commenting on this in my nonfiction writing and incorporating these ideas into the kind of fiction I want to write.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. Really well said. To your point about the church fathers, obviously Justin Martyr is perhaps most well known for this idea of the seeds of the Logos, being spread through human existence, and
right,
and then naturally, that sort of rises up in the pagan myths, which ultimately are a reflection of the true myth, right? The true myth of the gospel. And so, in that sense, all truth, wherever it's to be found, ultimately has its source and conclusion in God. So every good story,
fulfillment in Christ.
Yeah, exactly. So that's fantastic. Now, moving towards kind of our overlapping work right now, it just so happens that we're both starting podcast series on Tolkien's Tales from the Perilous Realm.
Yes.
So obviously it fits into the broader scope of what we've been talking about, but why in particular did you pick this collection of his short stories?
I actually picked it because of he includes as an appendix his essay on fairy stories. And there's actually a quote from On Fairy Stories, which is one of my favorite Tolkien quotes ever in anything he's done. And he talks about the realm of fairy story as the perilous realm, he calls it. And he has this great description of like the ideal fairy story. And I just want to read that briefly because it's so beautiful. He says, quote, "The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high, and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords," unquote. And that's just beautiful. I don't know what it is about that passage, but I'm like, that's it. That's the truth. That's what I want. That's what I want out of a good fairy story, out of a good piece of fantastical fiction. That's what I want. Like, if I couldn't encapsulate any better the kind of stories that I'm into better than that. And I think a lot of the tales that are included in Tales to the Perilous Realm reflect that quote. And so I thought it would just be a great place to start, a podcast that is talking about these sort of themes in fantastic fiction. I just thought it would be a good book as a jumping off point to discuss other things later.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Well said. Now, you kind of just mentioned this, that, he connects the idea of fairy to the perilous realm.
Right.
Now, in your understanding, what is the perilous realm?
Well, I think, and kind of jumping back to that quote, I think the perilous realm is where that sort of joy and sorrow meet. What he said, and this comes up several times in the Lord of the Rings, especially in Return of the King. If you remember the sequence from the Field of Cormorant, where Frodo and Sam are being, praised by the whole army and Aragorn and stuff like that, and what is it? The minstrel comes out to sing the lay of Frodo of the Nine Fingers and the Ring of Doom. And there's this great line where by the end of the story, everyone's in tears. And it says that tears are the very wine of blessedness, that they're not tears of sorrow. They're tears of joy, but of sorrow and joy mingled. And that this is somehow like what all these stories leads to, that's where it needs to bring you in the end. And I feel like the stories that have most moved me end that way. They all end that way. And I admit that I'm a sensitive guy to begin with, and I'll cry watching a movie. I admit it. But I mean the ones that most move me have that kind, take you through that whole emotional journey of eucatastrophe. And I think that that's where the perilous realm is to be found, in that kind of meeting of sorrow and joy that points towards the perilous realm points towards a world beyond the physical, what we can see and measure, and kind of brings our mind to think about transcendent things. I think that's an important point too. I don't know if any of that made sense, but it's
No, I think it did. And first of all, I'd like to say that I absolutely agree. One of the things I most love about Tolkien is the way he joins joy and sorrow. And we see this so many times throughout his Legendarium. One of my all-time favorite quotes from Tolkien comes from the Silmarillion, in talking about Ulmo and the, I think it's in the Quintus Silmarillion. He says something like, if joyful is the fountain that rises in the sun, its wells or its roots are in the wells of sorrow unfathomed at the foundations of the earth.
Oh, yeah.
It's absolutely beautiful. The idea that sorrow and joy are linked together. And of course, this is ultimately rooted in Tolkien's Christian conviction that, the world tree, so to speak, that holds everything together is the cross of Christ.
Right. Yeah. And that what seems on the surface to be kind of the ultimate tragedy, the death of God, is this source of everlasting joy for all Christians, for all who believe in him. So yeah, I definitely, it's so interesting with that. So like when I was in college, a lot of my friends were atheists or agnostic. I even had some neo-pagan friends, and they all loved Lord of the Rings. And I found Lord of the Rings to just be a very effective entrance point to Christianity, because I could say to people, well, he's coming at this from like a Christian worldview, and they'd be like, what? And so it just enabled a way to dialogue with people, and he did not write his Legendarium to be a tool of evangelization, really, or as an apologetics tool. But it is, I find, just an interesting way to talk to people, who may be otherwise interested in this kind of fantasy and science fiction literature, as kind of a way to introduce the fact that, like, Christianity, our faith, is not opposed to this, is not opposed to the world or popular culture. It wants to raise it up to a higher pitch.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think that right there says something about the Perilous Realm. Like you alluded to, it's something about the intersection between the transcendent and the worldly, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's where we kind of enter into this greater, more mysterious and potentially overwhelming kind of realm of being. It's the something that
Right.
breaks us out of the mundane.
And like he says, all creatures that can be found in the real world can also be found in the perilous realm, but they're at a higher pitch.
Mm-hmm.
You know, stars, the moon, the sun, animals, birds, you know, water and stone. Everything that's part of the physical world is also part of fairy, but it's almost more real in a
Right.
sense.
All tales may come true, but
Yes. Yeah.
right, but like and unlike, I can't remember the exact quote, but yeah, to what you're
Yes. Yeah.
saying. Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely. Well, that kind of brings us to our main topic of tonight, Leaf by Niggle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That segues very well into that story.
Yeah, so perhaps broadly speaking, before we might get into some of the specifics, you said that of all the stories, this is, what you wanted to talk about on this show. Why is Leaf by Niggle so important to you, or what's it mean to you, or however you want to take that?
Yeah. It's interesting. I first heard about this story when I went to a lecture. This was years ago. I think I was still in college at this point. I went to a lecture at a nearby seminary that was being done by a priest in our diocese who was also a Tolkien fan. And he read several passages to us. He read the Ainulindale from the Silmarillion, which just blew me away
Mm.
and made me want to read the Silmarillion right away. But then he also read Leaf by Niggle to us, or passages from it. And it was just one of the most moving stories I ever heard. Like, luckily, we were all given like pamphlets, which had, the story written out. So I took it home, I read it, and I'm like, this is one of the most moving, like, portraits of an artist that I've ever read. And having an artistic bent myself, it really spoke to me. I find a lot to relate to in Niggle, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners do as well. But yeah, it just really speaks to me. It speaks to um that kind of sorrow that, like, maybe you'll never finish the great work that you kind of have
Mm-hmm.
planned in your head, but also coming to accept that might be okay if you never finish it,
Mm-hmm.
and it just always makes me think whenever I get anxious about that stuff as a creative person. I like to return to Leaf by Niggle because it's always a tonic, I
Mm-hmm.
feel, for those kind of feelings of imposter syndrome or creative anxiety and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I definitely am drawn to it for similar reasons. I mean, people, I guess all people, whether you're driven towards industry in the marketplace or creative endeavors, right? It's easy to kind of set your ambition beyond your mortality and have that become a
Yeah.
frustration.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. That you want to be remembered for something. You want to be remembered for doing this great work and have a legacy that survives. And like, it can cause this kind of existential dread, to
Mm-hmm.
and it's and that's not healthy. And yeah, and like, Leaf by Niggle is a good kind of meditation on memento mori,
Mm.
remember you will die, but that we don't have to despair because, as you said, all tales come true, and our work in this life is going to be raised to a higher pitch in the next life, just like what happens with Niggle and his neighbor, Mr. Parrish.
Yeah, and so let's just kind of walk through that story a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Leaf by Niggle is certainly a unique story in that out of everything Tolkien wrote, it's probably the closest we get to allegory.
Yes, yeah, or autobiographical.
Right, or autobiographical, because didn't he write this while he was trying to write Lord of the Rings? I think it wasn't published between The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings originally?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't
I
actually
believe
know.
I
I
believe that's
almost
true.
Yeah, I almost thought I saw kind of like two illusions to him writing the Silmarillion in there
Yeah, that
too,
too. I mean,
because of
obviously, yeah.
the tree putting out all these branches, and every story he writes gets incorporated into it.
Mhm.
Like I saw the tree as kind of being Lord of the Rings, but also being an allegory for the Legendarium itself, because it's always
Right.
absorbing all of Niggle's other pictures. And I can really identify with that, because whenever I try to write a story that's independent of everything else I've wrote, it always ends up getting sucked into some other universe that I've created. And I'm like, no, I didn't want that. But it's like, you just have to go where the story takes you.
Right. And then you start to, as Tolkien talks about many times, discovering your own story essentially.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Uh, So so in the story, we and unfortunately I didn't reread it for this, but so Niggle is, working on this painting, and his neighbor, Parrish, is constantly asking for favors for him to, do this or
Interrupting
that.
him.
Yeah,
I
interrupting
love
him.
that, because that is me, where it's just like, I'm like, oh, I'm always being interrupted, like I'm trying to write and people keep interrupting me with things to do, and it's just like that. It's so relatable, and since you can tell this is very autobiographical, it's just very comforting to know that, oh, Tolkien had these kind of personality quirks too, or it's like, it, as creative people, we often feel put upon by other people coming to us and, quote, interrupting our work. But yeah, I like that Niggle reminds me a little bit of Bilbo in a way. I don't know if you caught that, where like he's very fussy, and he's very, like Bilbo in the beginning of The Hobbit. He's very fussy. He doesn't like unexpected things. He doesn't like people intruding on his time. So yeah, he's trying to paint this tree in what's, I think, meant to be like a wall-sized canvas.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, his neighbor keeps interrupting him. He wants to help him fix his roof. He says his wife is ill, and it like kind of intimates that she's very, very ill, but she actually just has a cold. And things
Right.
just but things just go south for poor Niggle from there. And also he's supposed to go on some kind of mysterious journey, but he keeps putting it off. And he's like, oh, I'll definitely finish this thing in time for that. And of course, that I think is supposed to be an allegory for kind of memento mori,
Mm-hmm.
death is coming,
Right. And then so he's so preoccupied with, his painting, and he's not even interested so much in painting the tree. His focus is, I need to paint these leaves. Right.
Right. Yeah.
So he's like down in the little gritty details, as it's, slowly building into this great tree, and there's a forest in the background, and all these things sort of coming together through his hyper focus on the details, but it's just never being completed.
Yep.
And so, then there's some bad rain, and the houses are falling apart, and and finally the inspector comes to Niggle and says, oh, but there is some wooden canvas
Oh yeah, he's like,
right.
yeah. There's plenty of stuff to repair the house here with this material. And he's like, what?
Right.
But he doesn't even have time to worry about it, because he's immediately bundled off to like, oh, your journey begins now. And he's just like, what?
Right. And so the driver shows up and says, all right, Niggle, let's go. And then the inspector says, all right, well, then you definitely don't need this wooden canvas now.
Yeah. And I like how the driver is dressed in black like an undertaker.
Mm-hmm.
Which was again, a very nice touch. Like,
right, very clear indication to the reader what's happening.
yeah. And how, like, when he gets on the train immediately goes through a tunnel, and I'm like, okay.
Right. So the next scene, he gets off the train, and I believe he kind of passes out and wakes up in the hospital.
He passes out on the platform when they're like, you must go, what, no luggage, you must go to the workhouse. And then he immediately falls over.
Right. So he goes to this hospital workhouse, where he's put to work, I think we're told, for centuries.
Yeah. Or it's implied that it's centuries. Yeah.
Right. I mean, basically the idea is kind of time almost becomes irrelevant for some span.
Now, very much a purgatory kind of place, or limbo.
Right. Where now he's, he spent his life kind of avoiding the practical things, and now that's all he's doing.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. He's like he's painting boards. They said he's doing basic carpentry, breaking rocks, like doing just, mundane kind of tedious physical work.
Right. So it's almost like his, punishment in this, purgatorial sentence is to do all the things he's been putting off.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So, eventually he's let off for good behavior, works his sentence. Um, and so then he goes on another train, right, to this, next location
Mm-hmm.
where, of course, what does he find?
Oh yeah, well he finds his tree.
He finds
But
his tree.
if I can backtrack for a second,
Yeah, of
when he's
course.
let off, I found the two voices very
Oh, yeah.
interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure what to make of them. I have a theory, but I don't know if it's what Tolkien intended. Because there's the one voice who's kind of like more harsh on
Mm-hmm.
Niggle, and there's the second voice who's kind of his advocate. And they have this dialogue. And I almost wonder, is the first voice the Father, God the Father, and the second voice Christ, where Christ is the advocate and he's pointing out all of Niggle's good
Mm-hmm.
points, all the things he has in his favor. And the first voice says, well, it's your job to handle these cases, so whatever you think is best. And I just the interplay between the two
Mm-hmm.
voices, I was like, oh, is this supposed to be where we're like a kind of Trinitarian? There's not a
Mm-hmm.
third voice at all, but I just thought like maybe that's what Tolkien was
Mm-hmm.
getting at there.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I don't have a better theory, so we'll let that stand.
But yeah, he goes to this kind of green area. He's let off on this train and he finds his tree, but in real life. And it's
Mm-hmm.
more real than he could ever have imagined it. And he's just bowled over by this realization that the
Mm-hmm.
tree is real, and also everything in the background in the
Mm-hmm.
painting is real, the forest, the mountains. And he encounters, of all people, Mr. Parrish is
Mm-hmm.
there. And they have this kind of this reconciliation where they both use their talents, the things that they're good at,
Mm-hmm.
to make this little area based on Niggle's painting even better. They build a house together. Like I think they said like Parrish is good at gardening. So he
Mm-hmm.
kind of takes care of all of the plants in the area, while, like you said, Niggle is still the details man. He kind of
Mm-hmm.
plans everything out.
Right. And we even find that even before they even start doing work, we see that the tree and landscape he made, as you said, it's even better than what he had painted. And it's like some of his intentions were already realized when he got there.
Right. Yeah. Things he had planned on originally, but had never
Mm-hmm.
had time, or were only kind of half baked
Mm-hmm.
during his previous existence, are kind of brought to fulfillment.
Right. And what do you make of the fact that um, now they're working and cultivating it and make it even better in this kind of plane of existence? Like, what is happening exactly in this scene? Do you have any understanding there?
Well, it's interesting. I can't remember where I read this, but there's this idea that Niggle represents like just a Christian. He
Mm-hmm.
represents a Christian believer. And Parish, that name is significant. That Parish is the church in a way. And it kind of represents the relationship between the individual believer and the church. And when they work together, they're able to cultivate, essentially the build up the kingdom of God,
Mm-hmm.
essentially together. And so there's this idea, whereas like before, Parrish and Niggle really didn't understand each other. They were sometimes at loggerheads. They definitely didn't understand one another. They
Mm-hmm.
made that clear, where it's like, Parrish didn't know what to make of Niggle's painting, and Niggle didn't want anything to do with what Parrish was interested in. But they find this kind of union when they unite their strengths. It's almost like uniting, the individual
Mm-hmm.
contributions with the kind of collective power of the church as the body of Christ, where we're all connected and able to where we can do more together than we can as just the individual. So
Yeah, I think there's
I
a lot.
think that might be part of what's going on
Mhm.
here.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. That obviously, before the journey, they had a very broken relationship. It wasn't
Right.
functional. Whereas now, I think that's so much part of this scene, seeing that relationship redeemed. Not only is Niggle's creativity redeemed in the reality of the tree, but so too their relationship is redeemed. It's made into what it always was meant to be.
Right, what it should have been. Yes, exactly.
Right. And they after they finish cultivating this whole area, they encounter the shepherd, which, all right,
Ah,
for all
yeah.
the flack he gave Lewis on on Aslan, I mean,
Aslan.
no, we literally have a shepherd walking up to bring him to the next area. But
Yes, yeah.
but anyways, so the shepherd, really points out, as you were saying, that they both have something to offer each other, right? Parrish is the one who's more practically and kind of earthly minded. He's literally he's a gardener, as you said. He's
Right.
more earthly minded, whereas Niggle is the creative one, the one who appreciates beauty. And so while Niggle couldn't be bothered with the earthly, Parrish couldn't see the beauty of what Niggle was doing.
No, yeah, he said like all he saw was lines and shapes and colors, but he couldn't perceive the whole of Niggle's painting.
Right. And in that, realization, Niggle even comes to defend Parrish at that point. Basically says, "Well, I could have done a better job of sharing what I was doing with him."
Right, yeah, yeah. I like that they both kind of, make confession
Mm-hmm.
almost of their previous faults, but that, but at the same time recognizing that, in this new existence, you know, it doesn't matter as much, and
Mm-hmm.
that despite those, they've they've come to this place where they can both live to like the fullest potential.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so once they learn what they need to learn, essentially, Niggle then goes off with the shepherd. I believe, like, basically outside the painting, right beyond the mountains.
Yeah, he goes to the mountains, and how he
Mm-hmm.
said like that they say that like the ground is always rising, like this far.
Mm-hmm.
It almost reminded me like a lot of this imagery reminded me of C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce too, because I think in that I think there were also mountains in that depiction
Mm-hmm.
of heaven. I can't remember, but a lot of this imagery was reminding me of that. It was very eerily similar.
Right. And of course, that imagery, we can see throughout the scripture and Tolkien's Legendarium,
Mm,
right? I mean, you know, biblically speaking, Moses goes up on the mountain. We've got the
yes,
Mount Zion. We've got in Tolkien's Legendarium. Think back to the Numenorian religion, right? They go up the
Menel
mountain.
Tarma, yeah, the Holy Mountain.
Exactly. Right. Um, it, and so obviously that's what's going on here, right? He's going into paradise essentially.
Yes, yeah, he's climbing the mountain of the Lord, essentially.
Right. But then Parrish stays behind for a while.
Right, he's waiting for his wife, I think
Mm-hmm.
he says, yeah, because
Right.
they built that house for them, where she's going to convalesce before they move on.
Right. So he wants to be there to meet her and to kind of catch her before they go off. And then there's the area which that area they've been working in was previously unnamed, and now it gets a name.
Yeah, Niggle's Parish, which is
Right.
just brilliant. Yeah.
Which again kind of hits the head on the nose on some of the things we've been talking about their relationship.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So and then we kind of get an epilogue, right? We go back to
Oh,
back to
right.
Earth. Yeah.
We go back to Earth, and there's like this weird scene with like there's the sort of town official who's very utilitarian and is like
Mm-hmm.
that Niggle wasn't good for anything. No practical or economic use, he says. And meanwhile, there's like this other person, I think he's a school teacher, who calls
Mm-hmm.
him a poor little man. He never finished anything, and who he he saves one leaf from Niggle's painting. He saves it and actually puts it in the local museum. But then oddly, there's this coda where it's like, oh, and the museum burned down later. So none of Niggle's work was actually left to posterity.
Which
but
I love that.
Yeah. It's kind of that reminder is like, to dust you shall return, guys. Nothing is gonna last, like.
Right. And so there's this what looks like it's going to be this concluding sentiment that, okay, there's some beauty that he created that's going to endure in this world. Nope. Then it burns down.
Nope. Yeah. Because like, what is it that people often say? Well, 4 billion years from now, the sun will expand and the earth will be a charred out cinder and nothing that we've created will endure at all. And it's like, well, yeah, not here, not in this world. But if you believe in a transcendent reality, like you said, like, as Niggle and Parrish's relationship is redeemed, all their creativity and talents are redeemed. So we have this belief that all of our sort of dreams and desires and aspirations will be redeemed in the next life. We, what is it? Eye is not seen and ear is not heard what God has prepared for those who love him, So that's really just a great thing to hold on to. And it's one of the reasons why I love this story so much. And I love going back to it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just so easy to get frustrated by your own mortality.
Yes. Yeah.
And then it can lead us on one hand to try to essentially hide from our mortality through being overly industrious and creative, feeling like I have to do everything all the time.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. And
then, of course, alternatively, we can see our mortality and then ask, what's the point in my little story? But what Niggle shows us is that our creative works do matter so long as they are kind of anchored to eternity in the chain of truth, goodness, and beauty. Right, that's what makes our works themselves actually eternal.
Right. Yeah. That when they're tapping into that source, because goodness, truth, and beauty are transcendent realities. They're transcendental realities. So when we tap into those, we kind of leave our mark on that realm, almost on the perilous realm, you could say.
Right, exactly. And so it doesn't matter that we'll be forgotten, because ultimately our at least our good endeavors are forever remembered, so to speak, in the mind of God, which is something that we participate in as Christians.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You have any other thoughts or points about any of this that you want to bring up before we start to kind of wrap things up?
Just that, yeah, I'd encourage everybody to read Leaf by Niggle. It's just it's very different from a lot of Tolkien's other work, but I feel in a way that makes it really special. And especially if you're an artist or a writer and you have a creative bent, I think you'll find a lot of comfort in this story. I certainly do. And yeah, it's like I said, it's definitely something, a tale that I return to over and over. And I definitely will be in the future. It was really fun to revisit it for this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm kind of, moving this to the front of my series. I'm starting off with On Fairy Stories and Leaf by Niggle, because I feel like both really set up Tolkien's creative philosophy.
Really I did the same thing. Yeah. I started with On Fairy Stories because I'm like, that kind of sets up, like you said, it lays the philosophical groundwork for everything that comes later.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground today. I really enjoyed it. I'd love to do more collaborations at some point in the future.
Oh, absolutely. This was a lot of fun.
And then, of course, remind us where we can find you.
Yeah, so you can follow me at my website, thomasjsalernowrites.com. Also, I have my own personal Substack, which is called Page Turning, at thomasjsalerno.substack.com. And also, like I said at the top, my friend Jake and I have launched our new Substack, rather, unchartedfaith.substack.com, where we hope to post a lot of really cool short stories in the future.
All right, fantastic. Well, thanks again, and I will talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Andrew. This was great.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, and again, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation, and if you did, be sure to subscribe, share this episode, leave me a 5-star review wherever you can so that way more people can find us, and support me on Patreon at patreon.com/AndrewNSnyder. Now next time, Lord willing, I will be joined by John Carswell as we discuss Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, which is found in the appendix of Tales from the Perilous Realm. And until next time, I wish you many meaningful trails ahead.